Voila, you guys.
Perfecto.
It's Mrs. Klein.
And Mr. Creighton.
We are here with your podcast for lesson 34 entitled Florence, the Cradle of the Renaissance. As always, you guys, there's a guiding question. This time it is, what advances were made during the Renaissance?
And the vocab, Dante Alighieri, Donatello, Florence, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Niccolò Machiavelli, and Secular. So looking at the introduction on page 475. The Renaissance began in the 14th century Italy. During this time, the Italian city-state of Florence was home to many advances, leading it to be called the Cradle of the Renaissance.
Florence is located on the Arno River, just north of central Italy. Between 1300 and 1600, it was home to some of the greatest artists and thinkers of the Renaissance.
Florence was the banking center of Europe during the Renaissance. Because of it, Florence's wealth helped to make it a leading cultural center of the Renaissance. In this lesson, you will explore Renaissance Florence's architecture and engineering, painting, sculpture, literature, science, and mathematics. You will also find out about the Florentine politics, commerce, and trade.
All right, you guys, moving into section 1 about the city of Florence. Florence was Italy's leading cultural center during the Renaissance. The city's location on the Arno River made it an important center for trade and commerce.
Renaissance Florence was dominated by a single family known as the Medici, who had acquired their wealth through banking. With their help, Florence became the banking center of Europe.
Florentines inspired still more creative activity. People learned from one another, and they sometimes competed to produce even greater works of art. Florentines were also influenced by ideas from other places, since the city drew travelers from many parts of the world.
Florentines were also inspired by the freedom of ideas that was at the core of humanism. Alright guys, looking at section 2, advances in architecture and engineering. Renaissance architects studied Greek and Roman ruins, modeling their own buildings on what they learned. They were particularly attracted to the rounded arches, straight columns, and domed roofs.
During the Renaissance, wealthy families built private townhouses known as palazzi, which is Italian for palaces. Most palazzi were built around a private courtyard, which might contain statues or other works of art.
Innovations in engineering made new kinds of architecture possible. One of the most impressive architectural feats of the Renaissance was the Santa Maria del Fiore, a great cathedral in Florence which was built in 1296. They did not know how to build a sufficiently large dome that would not collapse, so it took a Renaissance architect, Filippo Brunelleschi, to solve the problem.
All right, so Brunelleschi had studied ancient ruins in Rome and had also learned about the mathematics involved in constructing buildings. The dome he designed for the cathedral required true engineering genius.
The magnificent dome, which was completed in 1436, rose more than 300 feet above the city. Santa Maria del Fiore is also known as the Duomo, and it still stands today more than 500 years later.
All right, now about some advances in painting. The Medici family spent huge amounts of money on fine palaces, paintings, and statues. Patrons such as the Medici family created opportunities for talented painters who made a number of advances in style and technique.
Renaissance painters were influenced by their renewed interest in classical culture and the spread of humanism. One key advance made by Renaissance painters was the use of perspective, which created the appearance of depth on the flat surface.
All right, now moving on to the influence of science and mathematics. Science and mathematics also helped artists make other advances. The Florentine artist Masaccio used geometry to figure out how to divide the space in a painting to make scenes appear more lifelike. Some artists studied anatomy by observing bodies and how they moved.
Renaissance science gave painters new materials such as oil-based paints, which were made by mixing powdered pigments with linseed oil. Now looking at advances in sculpture, section 4. For the first time since the days of ancient Greece and Rome, sculptures made freestanding statues that can be viewed on all sides.
A Florentine named Donatello was one of the first sculptors to use the new, more lifelike style in his work, which expressed personality and mood.
The work of Michelangelo. So Donatello's David influenced Michelangelo, who was another great artist of the Renaissance, who was known for both his painting and his sculpture. Michelangelo created his own majestic statue of David, which may be the world's most widely admired sculpture.
All right, moving on to advances in literature. In medieval times, literature usually dealt with religious topics. In contrast, Renaissance writers were interested in individual experience in the real world. Writing about secular or non-religious topics became more common.
Most importantly, by the end of the Renaissance, most writers were writing in their own languages instead of Latin. The first well-known writer to create in a native language was Dante Alighieri of Florence. He He wrote his best-known work, The Divine Comedy, in Italian in the early 1300s. This long poem describes Dante's imaginary journey through the afterlife.
The Divine Comedy is a social commentary containing characters who are real people. Dante's work became a model for other Renaissance writers, such as Petrarch and Boccaccio. They wrote using the vernacular, or common language, so their words reached many more people. Guys, in my class, we talked about it probably in Mr. Creighton's vernacular. If I lived in Germany, it's German. If I lived in France, then French was the vernacular. So it was the language that people spoke.
If you lived in Canada, it was Canadian.
There we go.
Except for it's not. Number 6, advances in science and mathematics. The Renaissance was not just a time of progress in the arts. Scholars and others also made great advances in science and mathematics. One of the most creative Renaissance thinkers was Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was an artist, a scientist, an engineer, and an innovator.
Leonardo was endlessly curious about all aspects of the world around him. He studied anatomy, including the circulation of blood and the workings of the eye. He was the first person to draw maps from an aerial or above-ground view. He designed bridges, weapons, and many other machines.
Girolamo Cardano solved complex equations in algebra and did pioneering work in probability, the science of chance. Galileo Galilei conducted important experiments about gravity, proving that a heavier object and a lighter object fall at the same rate. By emphasizing observation and experimentation, Galileo and other Renaissance scholars paved the way for modern science and mathematics.
All right, now moving on to Florentine politics. Like other Italian city-states, Florence was ruled under a series of governing boards that were often controlled by rich families. The powerful Medici family controlled Florence for nearly 3 centuries.
The Medici family were involved in or controlled all aspects of life in the city. They were great sponsors of artists, writers, and musicians. One of the most powerful members of the Medici family was Lorenzo the Magnificent. A leading patron of the arts and scholarship, Lorenzo ruled Florence for more than 20 years, from 1469 until his death in 1492. 2 years later, a revolution forced the Medici to temporary exile until the family regained power in 1512.
All right, now, a Florentine statesman and historian, Niccolò Machiavelli, watched these struggles for power. Machiavelli used his experiences to write a book called The Prince, which is his account of how politics and government really work. Machiavelli advises rulers to make their state strong by doing what works best, rather than by doing what is good or moral.
All right, and then finally, Section 8, Florentine Commerce and Trade. One reason why Florence became a cultural center was the wealth that trade and commerce brought to the city. There were 2 market centers in Renaissance Florence. At the Mercato Vesiccio, or Old Market, people bought everyday items such as food.
The Mercato Nuovo, or New Market, was built in the mid-1500s as a center for the city's cloth and banking industries. The Mercato Nuovo became one of the largest financial marketplaces in Europe. People traveled from far and wide to get loans or to convert their money into florins, which could be exchanged for goods anywhere in Europe.
Alright guys, at this point you should be able to answer the guiding question, what advances were made during the Renaissance?
And we've got those vocabulary terms again: Dante Alighieri, Donatello, Florence, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Niccolò Machiavelli, and secular.
Ciao!
You the best!